One of the key questions that we get from clients is what happens to my superannuation fund when I leave Australia and become a non resident? To answer this question, I'm joined by Bradley Murphy of Murphy Tax based in Melbourne. Bradley, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Shiraz. My pleasure.
So, Bradley, as I've laid down the question, right, what happens to the superannuation fund for clients who leave Australia and become a non resident?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, Shiraz, and a very important and common question for Australian expats that leave Australia. So, first off, the normal rules still apply to Australian citizens that leave Australia with an Australian super fund, in that the fund can still be accessed and you can put money into the fund as a non-tax resident, and we'll come to some of the pros and cons of doing so in a moment. But the fund would still remain active. However, the normal rules still apply to the fund, in that the funds cannot be accessed until you reach your retirement age still. So even if you leave Australia, the funds are still normally locked up until you retire, which is normally age 60 for an Australian citizen or Australian permanent resident. And we can chat, of course, about what that means in terms of your long-term planning. But I think the important point would be that when you leave Australia, that the fund is still there to support your retirement, and it's still tax-free on the Australian side. So yeah, so once you become a non-tax resident, you can still access your funds from your Australian super once you turn 60, but unfortunately, you can't access those funds before you turn 60 and retire. There are some important restrictions for self-managed funds when you become a non-tax resident, which we'll cover in a moment as well.
Thank you for the background. And I would like to cover a few more questions in detail because these are the questions we get a lot from clients. Starting with the first one, that can I still contribute to the fund once you have become a non-resident, and how does that works?
Yep. So yes, you can still contribute to an Australian super fund once you become a non-tax resident. The exception to that is if you have a self-managed fund, then unfortunately non-residents cannot contribute to a self-managed fund in Australia. And again, we'll come to that in more detail in a moment. But effectively, there are two types of contributions you can make to an Australian super fund. These are pre-tax contributions and post-tax contributions. So those pre-tax contributions are called concessional contributions. And you can effectively put in $30,000 per year pre-tax into your Australian super. So that can be quite effective for a non-resident if you have Australian source investment income each year to put money into your super to offset some of that tax you'd pay as a non-tax resident. That could be from an investment property, from shares. Rather than paying the non-resident rates of taxation, which are relatively high, you can put some of that money pre-tax into your Australian super. The other bucket is non-concessional or post-tax contributions, which are post-tax contributions, which you can put in up to $120,000 per year post-tax into your Australian super. And you can do that still as a non-tax resident. Now, I would say there are some considerations to be mindful of, because putting money into super, although it can be quite tax effective, is one factor that can indicate your residency back to Australia as well. So if you're putting in frequent and large amounts of money back into your super, it can be an indication to the ATO that you do intend to return to Australia. So I think it needs to be looked at very carefully in terms of your overall circumstances. Is putting money into your Australian super going to impact your Australian non-resident status by doing so? So there's never a one size fits all with Australian super. It does depend a lot on your personal circumstances and your investment goals, of course, going forward.
Thank you. So my next question would be, what would be the tax implications on the growth of the fund and the withdrawals once someone has become a non-resident?
So good question. So effectively, the same rules apply to a non-tax resident if you look at an Australian retail super fund. So the growth of the fund, so the earnings inside the super fund get taxed at a rate of 15% on the earnings, or 10% for capital gains inside the super fund itself. And then once you turn 60, you can pull your money out from your super and withdraw it tax-free. So that still applies to a non-tax resident. So you can take your money out once you retire, once you've met your what we call preservation age, which is normally age 60. You can take money out from your super with no Australian tax. The only exception to that would be if you go above the super cap limits, which are currently $2 million in Australia. You do pay an additional tax rate if you if your total fund balance exceeds $2 million, you do pay an additional 15%. And if you go above 3 million, there's another tax to pay as well, which is effectively 30% on the earnings and growth once you're above $3 million. So I think in summary, if you're looking at a retail fund, so Australian Super, for example, you can basically pull your money out tax free once that limit, is under $2 million and you're retired. You can take it out tax free. Now, an Australian self managed fund, which is where you do it yourself, is different. And we can cover that in some detail in a moment.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I want to come to that. So can you advise like what are the complications, or if there are any complications, if someone has a self-managed super fund, and if the rules are any different?
Yeah, the rules certainly are different for a self-managed fund. So if you're going to become a non-tax resident, certainly you would need some advice around your self-managed fund, because effectively, once you do become a non-tax resident, that self-managed fund will be non-compliant if it has a non-resident trustee or member of that fund. So basically, unless you have an Australian director or Australian trustee of your self-managed fund, it will be non-compliant once you become a non-tax resident. Now, that's not a good outcome because it does mean a tax charge on the assets in the self-managed fund at that point. There is a sort of temporary concession for 2 years where that may not apply, but certainly once you become a permanent non-tax resident of Australia, if you have an Australian self-managed fund and you're still the trustee and member of that self-managed fund, it will be non-compliant at that time and crystallize a capital gains charge on the value of the assets at that point. So that is obviously not a great tax outcome at all. So to get around that, you can either look to wind up the Australian self-managed fund before you move overseas and put the funds into a retail fund, or you could appoint an Australian director under a power of attorney to keep the self-managed fund complying, but still be aware that you can't contribute to that self-managed fund once you become a non-tax resident of Australia. So it's a very complex area because, as you would know, Shiraz, self-managed funds are normally used to hold property or private investments in Australia. So they are quite common in Australia, particularly with higher net worth clients looking to move overseas. So I just recommend you get some advice before you move overseas if you have a self-managed fund.
Thank you. And like just a final question, overall, like if someone is planning to move overseas, becoming a non-resident and have to manage super fund, what is your overall advice on how to do it more cautiously so that they can be sure everything has been done correctly and not get into trouble with it too?
Yeah, another really, really good question. My advice normally is it's a very complex area. And as I said before, there's never a one size fits all. So I'd say just get some expert advice about that. It's a very complex area. So I'd recommend reaching out to myself or you, Shiraz, to get some advice around that.
Well, thank you, Bradley, for your time today.
Thanks, Shiraz. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.